Hello, my name is Jenny Thorvaldson. I'm the Chief Economist and Director of Data Development at IMPLAN. And today I'd like to talk to you about employment, a topic that is of interest to a lot of folks, just the general public, as well as policymakers and economists and across the board. And it does seem like a pretty straightforward topic, but as with most things, it's definitely nuanced. There are different types of employment and different data sources for different types of employment and for different industries. So I want to talk to you a bit about that. I'll talk to you about how how employment is defined in IMPLAN and some of our main data sources and methodologies for estimating employment values, and then also some important considerations when looking at employment data in IMPLAN and interpreting employment impacts. So I will go ahead and share my screen and start the presentation. All right, so the first thing to note is that there are two types of employment in IMPLAN. I'm going to give you a high-level view of both of those here, and then we'll talk about each of them in more detail next. So there's wage and salary employment, which includes workers who receive wages, salaries, commissions, tips, payment in kind, or piece rates. And if you're not familiar, piece rates are where you're paid for the number of units that you make or complete. So for instance, a technician who's paid by the number of telephone lines installed, or a car mechanic who is paid per tune-up completed, or a factory worker who is paid per widget made, etc. And this does include employees both in the private and public sectors. The second type of employment is called proprietor employment, or basically the number of proprietors. And this includes sole proprietorships, partnerships, and tax-exempt cooperatives. But it does not include employees of those proprietors. Employees of proprietors are wage and salary employees. Okay, so proprietor employment just includes the proprietors themselves. Something to keep in mind. All right, well, let's talk about those both in a little more detail. So let's first talk about wage and salary employment. A couple main characteristics is that it follows the same definition as that of the Bureau of Economic Analysis and Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is full-time, part-time, annual average by industry. And what we mean by that, well, I'll tell you that our main data source for wage and salary employment is the BLS's Census of Employment and Wages, CEW, data set. And I'm going to talk about that in more detail in the next slide. But that main data source, while we use the annual version of their data, they collect the data on a quarterly basis. And so it adjusts for seasonality in the sense that if a job existed for just one quarter of the year, when we get the annual data set, that job will appear as 0.25 of a job because it only existed for one quarter of the year. And likewise, for a job that lasts 2 quarters of a year, it would show up in the annual data set as 0.5 of a job. So in that sense, it is adjusting for seasonality. So because there's some jobs that only exist during the summer, for example, and that would show up as 0.25 or 0.5 job. And however, it doesn't indicate the number of hours worked. So there's no sense given of whether it was full-time, how many of the jobs were full-time jobs versus part-time jobs. However, IMPLAN does have a spreadsheet of ratios by industry that can be used to convert from full-time equivalent to this annual average concept, or vice versa. So for example, if you had an employment estimate that was in full-time equivalents, and you wanted to use that to set up an impact in IMPLAN, you would need to first convert your employment estimate into this annual average definition, and you could use those ratios to do so. Similarly, if you had employment impact results from an IMPLAN analysis and you wanted to report those in your report as full-time equivalents, you could use those ratios to go in the opposite direction and convert to full-time equivalents as well. And that spreadsheet is free for use on our support website. As I mentioned, our main data source is the BLS CEW data, and this data set includes workers covered by state unemployment insurance laws and federal workers covered by the Unemployment Compensation for Federal Employees program. A couple really cool things about this data set is that it comes with a lot of industry detail, more industry detail than IMPLAN has. And it goes all the way down to the 6-digit NAICS level, and that's about as detailed industry level that exists. And that's the North American Industry Classification System. That's what NAICS stands for. And it has various levels. 6-digit is the most detailed, 5-digit is a little bit more aggregate, 4-digit, 3-digit, and up to 2-digit, which is very aggregate level, where there's about 10 sectors. And so it comes very detailed, which is wonderful. And it comes, we have data, CEW data for the county level, at the county level, the state level, the national level, and there's also CEW data for Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, which is awesome because that is what allows IMPLAN to provide models for Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. So that's cool. Now, a couple important characteristics of the CEW data is that there are some sectors that aren't covered at all by the CEW data, and there are a handful of sectors that are undercovered, which means they don't have full coverage of that industry. So here I've listed them, and in parentheses, the data source that we use to either replace or augment those CEW data. So most agricultural workers on small farms are not covered, so we choose not to use CEW data for the agricultural sectors. Instead, we turn to NAS, the National Agricultural Statistics Service, and ERS, the Economic Research Service, where we get information for these sectors. Employees of small religious organizations are not covered well, and so we augment the CEW data with BEA, REA data, and that's Regional Economic Accounts, that's what REA is. Same for members of the armed forces. They're not at all in CEW, so we use BEA, REA. Elected officials in most states, some domestic workers, most student workers are not covered. And so for all of those, we use REA data. And then finally, most employees of railroads. But luckily, there's a railroad retirement board that does provide those data for us. Another important thing to note is that the CEW data is full of non-disclosures. And what that basically means is that the government doesn't reveal to us the number of employees or how much they earn in wages. What they will tell us, though, is the number of establishments in that industry. So we use that number of establishments and then various methods to create estimates. So we've got 4 tiers of what we call disclosure techniques. So they range from using the previous year's raw CEW data if it was disclosed, and then projecting that and applying it to the current establishment count, and then in a sense projecting it. So we might use basically we would grab last year's employment per establishment count and apply that to this year's count of establishments, and that gives us our first estimate. If last year's CEW data weren't released or published for this industry and this geography either, then we would turn to the census of the Census Bureau's CBP data, county business patterns data, and see if the data were disclosed there. And in the CBP data, we also have employment per establishments, and we can apply that to our current CEW establishment count. If the CBP data don't exist, then we might turn to 2 years ago CEW data and see if it was disclosed then. And if that isn't an option, then we would turn to the higher geography level. So if we're trying to disclose a county level, we could use state ratios of employees per establishment and apply that to the county number of establishments. If we were working on a state number and trying to get an estimate for it, we would use the US employees per establishment and apply that to the state number of establishments. Now, this is all to get first estimates. Those first estimates all get adjusted because we want to have full makes roll up. So we make sure that all of the 6-digit estimates sum up to the 5-digit parent industry or sector, and then all the 5-digit sectors that belong to a given 4-digit sector, they all need to sum up to that 4-digit parent value, and so on and so forth all the way up. One thing to note is we don't make any adjustments or changes at all to fully disclosed values. So a value that the BLS gives us in their CEW data for employment and wages stays fixed. We don't adjust those. We just make estimates for all the missing values, and we make sure all of our estimates sum up to the revealed numbers that BLS has given us. We also have some geographic constraints in there, and everything is ultimately controlled to the BEA's NEPA values. That's the National Income and Product Account values. That's what everything every year adds up to in the IMPLAN models. And I mentioned that in other videos. I won't go into detail on that here, but I also just wanted to point out to you, we have this support article, Estimating Non-Disclosed CEW Values. And if you just do a search on our support site for CEW, you will find that article, and it goes into great detail exactly how we do our disclosures and our controls and all of that. So you can look for it there if you're interested in more information. Okay, now let's turn to proprietors and talk to them about them a little bit, a few of the characteristics and main data sources for proprietors. Again, we follow the same definition as BEA. Already mentioned what that is: sole proprietorships, partnerships, tax-exempt cooperatives. And want to point out that this is an annual data set. They collect the data annually, so there is no seasonal adjustment there. Also, a thing to note that I don't have a bullet point here for, I apologize, but with the wages and salary employment, there is commuting data, and we do have data in IMPLAN for commuting, and this will affect your induced impacts. When you run impact analyses in IMPLAN, we do take into account that some workers, wage and salary workers, work in a different county from which they live. And so the household spending associated with that person is going to happen in a different place than where they're employed. So that is all accounted for in IMPLAN. But with proprietors, these data are residence-based. So it's just based on where the proprietor lives. So that's why we don't have to worry about any commuting data when it comes to proprietors. Our main data source is the BEA REA data that I've already mentioned previously that we use to augment some sectors in CEW. They also have non-disclosures, and we have a variety of techniques for them. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. We have data at the county, state, and US levels, and they have full coverage in the sense that all sectors are covered for. There aren't any missing sectors or any sectors that are undercovered. So the BEA REA data really help us augment the missing data from CEW, missing in the sense of sectors that just aren't covered at all or aren't covered well. One thing to note, though, the BEA REA data don't have as much sector detail. There are only about 100 sectors in there. So we end up having to give them some more detail. So it's quite involved. Okay, so how we estimate or generate estimates for non-disclosed values in BEA REA is a little more involved, and it's a little harder to summarize here because the BEA REA data have more data elements. So we have more options for disclosure techniques. And what I mean by that is the CEW data, they just have number of establishments, wages, and number of employees, 3 things. And it's wage and salary income, wage and salary employment, and establishments. Whereas with the REA, we have wage and salary income, we have employee compensation, we have total personal income, we have proprietor income, proprietor employment, wage and salary employment, and total employment. So there's a whole mix of those things that could be partially disclosed for, so in an industry, in a geography, some of those elements might be disclosed. They might give us values for some of those and not for others. So there's a whole wide mix of ratios and data we can use to estimate these non-disclosures. So for that reason, I'll leave you to this article if you have any more interest. We have an article detailing all of our techniques for that as well, if you're interested in that. We have full geographic roll-up for the BEA REA data. Instead of just having some geographic control measures, it's full geographic roll-up because the BEA REA only data only have about those 100 sectors, and they don't have multiple levels of sector detail, and so it's possible for us to get full geographic roll up for BEA REA, whereas that's not fully possible with the CEW data. And then this also, we ultimately control to that BEA NEPA value for everything, which is great. Okay, few important considerations with employment data. A couple things to know. Contractors. So for new construction sectors, contract employment is part of the direct proprietor employment number, okay? Whereas for all other sectors, contract employment appears as an intermediate purchase. That is, it's part of that purchasing sector's production function. So for example, if let's say the hospital sector contracts out its accounting and it doesn't have an in-house accountant, but contracts that out. It will not, that accountant will not show up as an employee in the hospital industry, but rather the hospital will make a purchase of the industry in which accounting services falls, okay? And so it will show up as indirect employment when you're running impact analyses. Okay, so that is how it is for all sectors except for new construction sectors. For new construction sectors, the contractors are part of the construction industry employment. They'll show up in proprietor employment. One other thing to note about construction sectors is that if you're modeling something related to construction, you'll want to note whether in a lot of construction projects, the construction company might bring a traveling crew with them and they may not be local employees. So keep that in mind when if you're modeling something related to construction. Those employees may not spend as much money there as they would if they lived there, right? They're probably just spending money on food and lodging primarily. So just something to keep in mind. A couple other important considerations. Wages per worker. It's critical to separate by type of employment because wage and salary workers earn employee compensation and proprietors earn proprietor income. So you need to keep those separate, and you wouldn't want to, basically to get good ratios of that, you want to keep those two types separate. And then also to keep in mind, there are some sectors where there are a lot of part-time workers, but for example, real estate. There are a lot of real estate agents in the US that aren't really, they have their license, but they're not actively doing that kind of work, or they're just doing it on the side. It's kind of a part-time thing. And there's other sectors where there are a lot of part-time workers. So wages per worker might appear very low, and it's because they're working part-time. So that's where those full-time equivalent conversion ratios that I mentioned previously would come in handy here, because you can get a sense of how much part-time employment there is in an industry. Another consideration is output per worker. A lot of times folks are interested in looking at productivity, which is defined as output per worker typically, and changes over time with that. Just wanted to point out that while there are two types of employment, there's only one type of output. So you'll have to take that into consideration and see how many proprietors are in that industry relative to wage and salary workers and things like that. And then also to note that in input-output models like IMPLAN, output is defined as the value of production. And there are sectors whose product changes in price more, let's see, how should I say this? There are some industries whose product experiences wild price changes. So for example, agricultural commodities often have a lot of variation in prices one year to the next. Another one would be refined petroleum and things like that. And so it's possible for the output of an industry to change drastically, even if the physical output didn't change a lot. And it's just, so in IMPLAN, output means value of production, so it's a dollar value, it's not a physical value. And so even if the physical amount of production stayed the same, the dollar value of output could change if the price of that commodity changed. So kind of have to be careful when saying that productivity increased and workers are producing a lot more. It doesn't necessarily mean that workers have become more efficient. It could just be that prices change. So you just have to keep that in mind when you're looking at that, that's all. And just wanted to point out that in IMPLAN, you can go to the industry averages table in the study area data section and see all these things: wages per worker, output per worker, and the wages per worker would be by both types of employment and all that. So easy to find there, already calculated for you. A few other important considerations that that sometimes folks don't realize at first is that in IMPLAN, private sectors are separate from government sectors. And so all the beginning sectors, all the industries up until postal service are private sectors, and then postal service and beyond are government sectors. And where this gets a little confusing, sometimes folks will look at the private utility sectors like electricity production and things like that, and they may not see any employment there, and they're say, wait a minute, we have a utility here in this county, where are those employees? And we'll say, oh, well, is it a government owned? Is it a public utility? And if so, it's going to show up in the 500s of the sectors, the later sectors where you have public utilities and things like that. So keep that in mind. And same with transportation. There's some, public transportation sector that's separate from private transportation sectors. Another thing to note is that a job is not necessarily always equal to one person. People can hold more than one job. So a job isn't not every job employs a new person, if that makes sense. So I just want to point that out if that is important to you. Also important when you're running impacts to be mindful if you're running multi-year projects. This comes back again to construction projects. Often they are multi-year projects, and which means that the job impact in 1 year, you may have 50 people employed for 5 years of this project. You wouldn't want to count that as 250 jobs. You would want to count that as 50 jobs that last for 5 years each. So keep in mind, make sure you aren't blowing up your employment impacts to be 250 employees when it's 50 employees for 5 years. And I did already mention commuters to you, so I already took care of that, just for you to know that IMPLAN takes that into account. And then lastly, I wanted to tell you about occupation data, because in the region data in IMPLAN, you'll see employment by industry, but in those tables, it doesn't give you any information on the types of occupations in those industries and how many employees of each occupation type are in those industries. And so wanted to point out to you that IMPLAN also has occupation data that goes into more detail about the number of the different types of occupations in each industry and the number of employees in each of those occupations. Additionally, there's information on the education, typical or average education level and training and skills and hours worked and wages by occupation. So there's a lot more detail there. And I'll just give you a really quick overview here. I'm going to pull IMPLAN over. Here I am looking at the United States data 2019, and I'm over here in the occupation data portion. You can see, if you can see my mouse moving. And here I have chosen the hospital industry as a good example to show you all the different types of occupations that are in a hospital. You've got nurses, nursing assistants, medical assistants, certain therapists and technicians. Then you've got janitors. And so here you can see the different type employment levels of each of these very detailed occupations. So that can be very insightful. And then you can even look, like I said, if I click on occupation again, I can scroll down here and do core competencies, and you can do it by your region as well as by specific industries. And so that's something that might be of interest to some of you. All right, well, that's all I had for today. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.